of the Chinese government, or whether because you have some other more nefarious purpose, then who better to take it over than someone that already has, Trump slapping him on the back and say, where you go.
Look, we got this possible sale of the American arm, I guess, of TikTok. Elon Musk being mentioned. First of all, we've got this sort of this ban coming in the day before Joe Biden leaves office. Why does the Biden administration dislike TikTok?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many questions around this story, and so many questions around TikTok and what will happen to it and why. And it's kind of hard to know where to start. I mean, this wasn't Joe Biden's idea. I mean, that's one thing to start off with. This was President Trump's idea. It's this whole idea of forcing a sale of TikTok or closing it down dates all the way back to 2020, when President Trump, in the face of, well, whatever reason you want to attribute, suddenly became very anti-China, possibly in the wake of coronavirus and the controversy around that, or possibly in the wake of other things. And he started becoming very anti-China, threatening tariffs on Chinese imports. And one of his targets was TikTok. He said he wanted to ban TikTok because it was an agent of Chinese influence, which other people have said, to be fair, that was an issue. Its Chinese ownership had been raised as an issue. And then there was an injunction. TikTok took out an injunction against this ban. That was going through the courts when Trump left office at the beginning of 2021, and the whole idea was dropped because that ban was as an executive order. But then it was resuscitated by Congress, and on both sides of Congress decided that it was a bad idea to have TikTok owned by the Chinese, and that was supported by the Biden administration, who signed it all into law. But in the meantime, President Trump had changed his mind and a complete volte-face, said he thought it was free speech issue and that TikTok shouldn't be banned. So that's where we are. I mean, the issues are twofold. The two main issues that have been raised is, one is that ownership of a social media company gives you access to whole loads of data, which those algorithms and computer programs and so on all collect and process of its users. And that they believe is an inherent national security threat. And the second one is that being owned by China in some way, even though it's not subject to Chinese censorship, in some way it can be used by China to influence public opinion, and that's also inherently dangerous. So those are the two issues that Congress have cited, and which are now being argued about, including in the Supreme Court, where this is also being discussed.
There'll be an awful lot of people listening to this who are users of TikTok and who say, all right, my data's in there. But in the end, what I'm doing on TikTok is filming myself cooking dinner or doing a silly dance or whatever. How can China use that sort of data to its benefit, in theory?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. One of the questions about this that people have asked is, why is the data I give to TikTok so much more sensitive than the data I give to a app like Temu, or an online purchasing company, or indeed all the other data that the Chinese can hoover up, or we can all hoover up. I mean, it's not just China, of course. Could America access data from, Apple if it really needs to? In case of national issues of national security, these are all questions that can legitimately ask. What about all those computer chips in Chinese electric cars? What can they do? Brett Kavanaugh, the Supreme Court judge who's hearing this case, one of the judges hearing this case, he raised an interesting point. He said, what if your online habits, as a teenage TikTok viewer, whatever you're downloading as a teenager on TikTok, I mean, who knows, it might not be very savory. Could that be used to blackmail you in 20 years' time, by which time you may be working for the CIA or the State Department or the FBI or something? So there's that's the issue about data. It's just this idea that we're all slightly uncomfortable, I think, with how much data there is out there. We all know about, we're all used to the fact that the minute we, go online and buy a pair of shoes, we're bombarded with ads for shoes for the next months afterwards. And people are thinking, well, on a state level, what could a state be doing with apparently trivial information once it's aggregated, you know, used to psychologically profile you, work out who you are, what you're thinking, who your friends are, who you're dealing with. What if that's used by a malign power against you? As I say, the answer, the problem with that is, we're all now being monitored somewhere. If you take that analysis.
What is the current relationship between the US arm of TikTok and the Chinese operations of TikTok? And if there was a sale that went through, are we to all assume, okay, these effectively, to all intents and purposes, become separate companies, and therefore our data, if we are an American user of TikTok, is safe?
Yeah, so there's actually two. That's actually two questions cunningly disguised as one question, because the relationship with TikTok and China is quite straightforward. There's a Chinese company which, as far as we know, is a private company. It was founded by a Chinese entrepreneur, built up from, like any other of these new tech social media companies, built up from scratch. And it owns a number of different social media brands. I mean, its two most famous brands are TikTok, which is a Western brand, and it's not operated in China. So there is no TikTok in China itself, but there's a Chinese equivalent called Douyin, Douyun, which basically does the same thing for Chinese people, and it's all in Chinese basically. I mean, but I could, as with all these apps, you could go on and download Douyin and upload your English language videos onto that if you wanted to. But basically, like a lot of the world, a lot of social media is now locked into these two halves. One inside the Chinese firewall, which is subject to Chinese censorship and very tightly controlled by China, which is the Chinese version of these apps, some of which are owned by which are all Chinese owned. And then there are the non-Chinese versions of the apps, most of which are not Chinese owned, like Twitter or X. But in this case, TikTok is owned by the same Chinese company as owns the Chinese version. So what hasn't really been addressed by this very precisely by this new American law is what exactly a sale of TikTok would mean. Now, obviously, if they don't sell it and US closes it down, then that's fairly simple. That would just effectively mean that you couldn't download the app in America. There would be a block on it. It would be a bit like China, where you'd have to get a VPN to tell the authorities that you were in Germany to download the app. It would raise questions about whether TikTok was then viable. Obviously, its biggest market is America. But would TikTok carry on being an app that operated outside America and inside America with a VPN? Is that how it would work? If you sell it, then what are you selling? Do you just sell? Do you hive off a TikTok arm of the wider TikTok company, and then you effectively have two TikToks. You have one in Europe, which is still owned by the Chinese company, and one in America. And how do those two companies, operate together? Do you simply get around it by having a licensing agreement between the American version and the non-American version, so that you're still seeing the same TikTok when you're on one or the other, but it's just that the American company holds the data of American people who log on and use it. That, of course, wouldn't get around the influence aspect, because you could obviously upload American targeted influence ads if that's what you're doing, or influence videos from outside. But it would get around the data issue as long as there was no leakage. So that's quite a technical question. I don't claim to know how easy that would be, but that's, I guess, what people in TikTok are working out at the moment. How that would actually operate.
I understand the benefit to the company of selling over a sort of outright Supreme Court ban, but as you say in your piece, they are tied up with the Chinese government as well, and you state that there is some interest from the Chinese government in selling. If TikTok truly is this sort of data mining vehicle, as opposed to something that we can all just sit and watch videos on, in its purest form, as it were, What is the benefit to China of allowing this to be sold rather than just, well, we'll just forget it, bin it all off, it gets banned, and then forget about it. We lose the data either way. Is the point I'm making?
Right. So one issue is the algorithm. Now the sort of algorithms are kind of algorithms, as we all know, now at least I think we're all familiar with the term, are what makes these social media channels work, how they operate, and they're like the master code. That's the real intellectual property. Is how you maximize the effect of your algorithm. So um, that and a bad algorithm makes your social media site not very useful or not very profitable or not work very well. I mean, the point about the algorithm in this case is it directs, it's the algorithm, the computer code that works out what you want to watch on video, on your TikTok video, and send it in your direction, because that sort of targeting is what makes it financially viable. Now, it's also what makes these things incredibly sensitive and important, because it's very, to the extent that these things are sensitive, that's what makes them sensitive. That's how you influence. That's how you influence people. And China is a control freak nation. It wants control of things, and it has a law saying that algorithms cannot be the trademarked algorithms. I mean, I don't think trademark is the correct term, but proprietary algorithms that have been invented in China or designed in China cannot be sold abroad without Chinese government approval. So it wants to keep that algorithm as Chinese. And we don't know exactly the conversations that ByteDance, the Chinese owner, and the Chinese authorities are having. Both sides are insistent that there's nothing national security about this. It's not about data scraping. It's nothing to do with the government in terms of what ByteDance does. It's just a commercial firm, but they are operating within that Chinese legal environment. Now, the interesting story to me, one of the interesting stories about this idea that's been floated, and apparently it's been floated by the Chinese government, is not being floated by Musk himself or by any of the Musk agents or by TikTok. It's been floated by the Chinese government themselves, is that maybe you could sell it to him. Now, why would you do that? Well, if they're not going to sell the algorithm, if the deal is we sell the company that operates the algorithm in the US, which is, if we sell TikTok US, but the algorithm stays in China, and as I say, TikTok has some sort of access to the algorithm without actually owning it. If that's what they want to do, then you've got to think, well, what is your incentive to buy to spend $50 billion, which apparently is the price that people are talking about for TikTok US? Are you going to do that when the algorithm, there's a key bit of it, stays in China? Why would you want to do that? Well, then you look at Musk, of course, and Musk, is currently famous for being close to President Trump and the Trump administration and playing a role in Trump's new administration. But before that, he was also very close to the Chinese Communist Party. It still is. He earns $22 billion a year. Probably we don't know his figures for last year, but sales were up last year. That's the figure for 2023 from Tesla sales in China. His biggest his biggest Tesla factory is in China. He relies on Chinese-made batteries for their supply chains. His relationship with China is commercially incredibly important to him, more important than anything else commercially. And he goes and meets the Chinese leadership. He meets the prime minister regularly. So they may be thinking, well, if we, who will do us a favor and agree to this, this deal whereby they'll get the US off the backs of ByteDance, off the backs of this successful Chinese company, do this deal just to get the regulators off you, take over TikTok, run it as a extension of ByteDance, which is what it would effectively become under those terms. Pay you huge amounts of money for it, under those terms. And they're thinking, well, maybe someone who already is, a friend of China already. I think that's probably how they came up with the name Musk.
Yeah, I mean, the Musk thing is what obviously makes the headlines as well at this moment in time, isn't it? And well, I've got two questions about it. We'll ask the first one is about Trump in particular, and you've talked about how he sort of changed his mind on TikTok over the 4 years he's not been in office. I wonder as well whether the idea of Musk would be a positive for him, because forget the data stuff we've been talking about, but in pure content terms, if you look at Twitter under Musk, it's become far more favourable to Donald Trump, and I wonder whether that might be seen as a benefit by the president-elect.
Yeah, well, I'm sure that's true. I'm sure that I'm sure, and again, I'm sure that's one of the reasons why Musk's name came up, because if you want to, if you want this deal to go through, if you want TikTok to survive, whether because you want the best for your Chinese company, if you're the Chinese government, or whether because you have some other more nefarious purpose, then who better to take it over than someone that already has Trump slapping him on the back and say, where you go. So that's clearly one of the ways they're thinking. And of course, what we haven't heard from is Musk, whether he's any interest in buying another social media platform. I mean, I think it's always unclear what Twitter would be worth, but the conventional thing is it's lost value since he took over. So whether he would want to, as I say, put $50 billion into another venture that might not be so successful afterwards and under these slightly uncertain terms is unclear. But as I say, there's also questions about who else would want to take it over under those terms. So, we await that Musk response. Quite interesting. He might be sitting and thinking quite hard now what he's got himself into.
And just finally, from the political point of view that you've been talking about, I mean, we've spoken to you so many times about what might Donald Trump do in terms of general relations between the US and China and the tariffs and all of that. You've talked about Musk's relationship to the Communist Party in China. We know about his position in government in once Trump comes back in on Monday. Is there any possibility that if this deal happens, given that link, Musk and China and Musk and Trump, that actually the entirety of governmental relations between China and the US could be smoothed in some way?
Yeah, so one thought, which is entirely speculative, did occur to me looking at this TikTok issue. Not even before this, when I was looking at why did Trump make this sudden reversal. One point was that obviously a lot of the people he surrounded with himself in the second election campaign were people like Musk with a interest in social media, and therefore a interest in social media not being censored or controlled in any way. The tech bros for Trump nexus, if you like. That's the obvious way of looking at it, that he just came under pressure from them, and and they were stressing the free speech issue, obviously, and that may just be his his political play. It does also occur to me that Trump, as we know, is loves making stupid comments that everyone laughs at, but has more of a methodology underneath. It may not be a sensible methodology, but may be a sensible, but it's all based around this idea of a deal. He wants to strike deals, and he may be that he is thinking, let's not ban this outright. Let's not go along with the Biden ban. Let's leave it up in the air, and we'll throw it into the pot with all the other things that are going into the pot in terms of US-China relations. You've already got the issue of tariffs, which there are huge numbers of competing claims about how far he'll go to implement the tariffs on China that he's threatened. There are existing tariffs that the Biden administration put on China, which could be lifted or made worse. You've got all the stuff about Taiwan, military relations, cooperation on climate change, technology, all these other issues that are key to the, you could be really melodramatic and say they're key to the future of the world if, given the America-China relationship is so important. And Trump is just stirring the pot, keeping all those issues in the foreground, so that he can, hold one against the other and do deals. That may be how he's seeing things. But that's just a purely speculative point from my point of view. But it would explain why on so many of these issues you're seeing stories emerge in the in the weeks before Trump's inauguration, saying, "Oh, here's something new. Here's some new possibility. What about TikTok sold to Musk?" Or last week it was Trump completely changing his view on what tariffs he's going to put on China, and it's let's float that boat, let's float that idea, and we're setting the stage for sort of a whole series of negotiations and putative deals with China and Xi Jinping.